Hello, and welcome to the Upwards podcast, where we discuss the intersection of Christian faith in the academy, church, and marketplace. I'm Dan, one of your hosts, and I'm here with Thomas Albert Tal Howard, who's a historian and the author of a new book with Yale Press called Broken Altars: Secularist Violence in Modern History. And if you're a loyal listener, you might recognize Tal Howard's name because he was on the podcast a very long time ago in late 2021 to talk about another book he wrote on the history of interreligious dialogue. So we'll link to that in the show notes and encourage you to listen to that if you like the conversation here or if you like that topic of interreligious dialogue. Here we're set to talk about a much, you could say, different topic than interreligious dialogue, but one that is fascinating nonetheless. So, Tal, great to have you with us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I thought first, if you could just introduce yourself, where you teach and what you teach, then we'll get into the conversation on the book. So where are you and what do you teach?
Sure. Yeah, I teach humanities and history at Valparaiso University in Indiana. This university has a Lutheran background, and I teach in Christ College, which is the honors college, which is sort of a great books oriented program or college. And so do most of my teaching there. But I'm trained as a historian, but I also hold what's called the Duesenberg Chair in Ethics here at Valpo, as we say.
Hmm. And what on a given semester, what are the types of classes you're teaching to students at Valparaiso?
I sometimes teach in the first year program, which is sort of a survey of great books from Plato, Aristotle, the Bible to the present. I taught courses on Christianity and other faiths. I regularly teach a class called the Christian Tradition here and various other, more specialized seminars or colloquia.
Got it. Okay, so as we go into this topic of secularist violence, give us a sense of what drew you to this topic and made you want to, dedicate a number of years to researching it as a book project.
Yeah, it's really a project that grew out of just the discussions after 9/11. There's a
Mm,
lot of discussions and conferences on religion and violence, and this term religious violence was used over and over again. And certainly, I do not deny at all religion has contributed to violence. Later on, maybe we need to define this term religion. But as a
mhm.
historian, I look kind of the big picture in modern history. If you take a global view, is really kind of governments, dedicated to types of secularism, what I call combative and eliminationist secularism, and the violence that they have sometimes perpetrated against religious communities. So that's kind of the general conversation I saw this book entering into.
Yeah, so let's go to that question of definition. So I think two big terms that obviously are important to this conversation are secularism or the secular, and then religion. And I think maybe for a lot of people, religion seems the more natural term. It's a term that most of us use pretty regularly in our lives. When we see polling, we have sort of a group of religions. Give us a sense for those who aren't familiar with the sort of intellectual history of the term. What should we know about the term religion to help us think critically about it?
Yeah, maybe if I could just take on both religion and
Mm,
secularism here, and your viewers, listeners, might be interested in a scholar by the name of Talal Assad, because I
mm,
draw from him regularly in the book, and he makes a persuasive case to me that in some way these two terms and the binary assumed between them are distinctively Western phenomenon. And many cultures did not have a word for either of these. It's only in the modern period of 19th and 20th century, under the influence of the West and colonization, that they acquired words. Religion is kind of an abstraction. Generally in the West, it was used. If you rewind the clock, 400 or 500 years, religion meant something more like piety or
mm.
devotion. But it's only in the modern period that it became this genus term, where there's these different species: Hinduism, Buddhism, etc. So other cultures have preferred things like law or civilization, but also secularism too, as a binary opposite. This really kind of came to the fore in the Enlightenment and especially in the wars of religion after the Reformation, 17th and 18th century. And on the 19th century, that this sort of binary took shape
Mhm.
etymologically, if you will.
So what is for the way we think about those terms in uh I guess as we use them in general common language, what's missed if we don't appreciate that history of how these terms are used sort of in particular ways in the West in particular?
Yeah, I'm not saying that they're completely constructed or they don't attempt
Mm.
to describe and in many ways describe real realities, but it helps one be sensitive to one's own cultural, one's language, one's own. I'm going to use a fancy term here, epistemic situation, if you
Mhm.
will, and that different cultures have developed in different ways in different languages. But again, in the 19th and 20th century, there has been something of a globalization of this binary between secularity and religion.
Right. I think one way that this helps your project in particular is that you're able to then give us your sort of read of these different types of secularisms, right? So that if the term has a history, then we can start to sort of understand different ways to apply the term and different gradations of the term. So as we get into sort of the core analytical framework of the book, where you've got these three different types of secularism, give us what those are and and the definitions of each one of them.
Okay. And in some way, all three of these arose in the West, but the project
Mm.
in the book is very much a global project.
Mhm.
The three are passive secularism, combative secularism, and eliminationist secularism. I think for many people in the West, they assume that passive secularism is what secularism really means, and it describes, certain church-state arrangements. The United States and the First Amendment, that the government will not meddle in people's faiths, and they will have freedom to practice their faith. And versions of that you can find in the North Atlantic world and Western Europe. But taking a more historical and global view, I argue that another strand is combative secularism, and this really grew out of the more radical phase of the French Revolution in the 1790s
Mm.
that instigated this program of de-Christianization. It's highly anti-clerical in nature. You could find its roots in 18th century philosophers such as Voltaire and Diderot, and it's has its own genealogy in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, I profile three countries where this type of combative secularism, resulted in state-sponsored violence, and those Spain and Mexico, but also Turkey as well. And then finally, the eliminationist secularism. This really grows out of the more radical thought of the 19th century Marxists, but especially Marxist-Leninist thought in the late 19th and 20th century. Of course, Marx famously, spoke of religion as the opium of the masses. But with the Soviet Union, after the Bolshevik Revolution, there was, became a sort of a political program to hasten religion's obsolescence. Marx himself didn't write that much about, how religion was going to disappear. He focused more on economic and political issues. But, the Bolsheviks, Russian revolutionaries, tried to hasten that beginning in the Soviet Union, but then spreading to other parts of the world. And with Maoism and the Communist Revolution in China is another part of that story, but also Eastern Europe and places like North Korea and even Cuba to a lesser extent. You could characterize this type of secularism.
How did you come up with these three forms? Like, is this something you uh, I don't know, came into the project sort of intuiting, or was there a moment while you're doing your research that you really started to see differentiation here? How did it come about?
Yeah, I borrow, as scholars often borrow from other scholars, and I do
Mhm.
due diligence and recognizing where I got this in a footnote in the introduction. But the political scientist Ahmet Kuru, the Turkish scholar, teaches at the University of California, San Diego. I took passive secularism from him. He
Hmm.
has a lovely book that sort of compares state church relations or state religion relations, I should say, in France and the United States and Turkey. Combative secularism, I take from a French historian and scholar of what the French call laïcité, secularism. Jean Boberot is his name. And then eliminationist secularism, I take from an anthropologist of Soviet secularism. Sonia Luhrmann is her name. Sadly, she's recently passed away.
Hmm.
But those are the three sources. And once I got those categories in my mind, I was sort of playing with them, and I said, this actually has a good bit of explanatory power. Recognizing too that especially in the world of ideas and journalism, usually when people in the West say secularism in a political sense, they're talking more about passive secularism. But I'm trying to maybe widen the historical and global perspective um, on the term and the realities.
Right. So one thing that struck me about these three categories is that I mean, I don't know exactly how you date them, but there is a sense where passive secularism is the oldest, a little in terms of the American experiment. If the French experiment is sort of the combative, and then the eliminationist comes with Marxism Leninism. Did you think about that as sort of is there any sort of chronological organization here, or are those sort of incidental to the way you want to think about these
Yeah, no, I
categories?
think there's a little bit of a chronology. Probably could find some of the roots of all three of them in the 18th century, but
Hmm.
and with passive secularism, it's often traced back to figures like John Locke and even earlier figures as well. Combative secularism, I would see kind of that more in what the intellectual historian Jonathan Israel calls the radical
Right.
enlightenment, the anti-clerical dimensions of the 18th century enlightenment. And then the eliminationist secularism, radical thought in the 19th century, Marxist, but also the Russian intelligentsia, very critical of both Tsarism and the Orthodox Church. So you really had kind of a demolitionist um, radical secularism developed then that was sort of very marginal, but with the Bolshevik Revolution and the coming to power of Lenin and then Stalin, it actually sort of achieved historical actuality.
Is there any sense that also the more like eliminationist secularism? So we're talking here about some of the most violent, expansive attempts to suppress religion in a society. That there's a sort of technological story where that's only even imaginable at some point when you have the technology to, you know, survey and I guess with violence sort of suppress a massive land area with a massive population. I don't know. Is that something that actually becomes more imaginable as the technological capabilities of states becomes bigger
Yeah, no,
throughout
that's
this
an interesting
history?
question. I haven't received that question before. I mean, probably whether it's secular or religious or any other form of political violence. Various governments have used all kinds of different technologies, but in the 20th century, types of surveillance, especially,
Right.
might be. I know in Eastern Europe, different countries in Eastern Europe, and of course in the Soviet Union, the KGB as well. Political dissidents were often targeted, but certainly there was real concern about religious communities as well, and sort of a source of
Right.
moral authority apart from the state. And the view sometimes that religion was often connected with ethnicity, so there were worries about separatism and
Hmm.
those types of things. So I think you could say there's a technological dimension of it.
Okay, so let's spend a little time on these three forms. Your book spends the most time on combative, and then eliminationist is sort of the big chunk of the last book. But we do start with passive. So I think this is the one, as you mentioned, is most familiar to Americans, at least. This is passive secularism. It tends to be how we talk about an ideal of separation of church and state, a wall between church and state, those types of metaphors. Give us a little more on what is the philosophical underpinning, and then how does this type of secularism play out in a society?
Yeah. Um, yeah, you're right that I mean, since this is a book about, violence in the name of secularism, I focus more on combative and eliminationist secularism in the book. But as a foil, I do have some things to say in the
Mhm.
first chapter about passive secularism. And I try not to say this is just an American thing. I mean, that would
Mhm.
be an example. But I profile the Belgian Constitution of 1831, European thinkers like Lord Acton or John Stuart Mill or Alexis de Tocqueville. And so I think you could see in Canada, Britain, um, even if there are differences, Britain has a state church, Denmark
Mhm.
has a state church, but there's more or less a type of religious uh, the government takes a passive role to the religious sector of society. And one perhaps could trace this all the way back to the things that are Caesar's and not Caesar's and the Bible and sort of a long separation of the political power and religious authority in Western history. In its modern instantiations, I think figures like John Locke, who mentioned before, or in the United States, Madison and Jefferson would be arguments in favor of this form of secularism.
So, is there a I've mentioned, separation of church and state being one ideal. Are there other things that you look for when you think of a passive secularist society, beyond this attempt to find sort of separate? I don't know if it's separate spheres or sort of separate roles
Yeah,
for the state and religious institutions.
yeah, yeah. I would look for something beyond just freedom of worship. In the
Mm,
in some of the other cases that I mentioned, often there was a legal provision for freedom of worship, but that was usually in the confines of a church. But in terms of being active, wearing religious clothing, or proselytizing, or just public involvements that avoid religion, that was more seen as taboo and particularly subversive and dangerous. So when I think of passive secularism, I'm looking for something beyond just technical freedom of worship.
yeah, and for those who are more into American history, one of the things you learn beyond the Bill of Rights and the First Amendment and so forth is that on the state level, there remained, um, state level churches through the 1830s for some of the states in the United States. How do you make sense like, is that, um, does that fit into the passive secularist model, or was that just something that sort of was that the outgrowth of passive secularism taking over the broader culture? How do you think about a sort of a hitch in the smoothness of the story, like state churches in the United States?
Yeah, no, I mean that would be, and again, you could point to countries like Denmark and Britain and Germany,
Right.
still have somewhat established churches, even that they allow freedom. So I think it can coexist with that. And the U.S., it gets into the complexities of the federal level versus the state level, and
Hmm.
just the great religious heterogeneity that was in the United States and in its founding period that worked against the establishment of just the Anglican Church or the Puritan or the German Lutheran Church. So I would see it as I wouldn't make too firm a distinction between, say, the American model or Britain or Denmark, or for that matter New Zealand or Australia. Various India, you could even argue, has a form of passive secularism. Although I do not treat India in this book.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Okay. So if passive is, as you said, the foil for thinking about some of the more bigger examples of secularist violence in history, talk to us about combative secularism. So this is sort of the middle category. It's not the most extreme and destructive, you could say, examples, but there are many examples in this category. What are the key features of a combative secularist um, society, I guess you could say, and particularly what are the What are the historical examples that you find
Y-
most illuminating?
Yeah, I mean, in brief, the distinction I make between combative and eliminationist secularism is that combative tends to be more anti-clerical in
Mm,
orientation, or in a critique of the church, sometimes for good reason. Where eliminationists, which is more hitched to a Marxist-Leninist theory about the obsolescence of religion at some future point, is a little more comprehensive in its anti-religious
hmm
dimension. Some scholars sort of see the French and American Revolution as sort of two sides of the same coin, and maybe in some ways they are. But I tend to make a distinction between them, especially in the religious sphere. In the more radical and Jacobin stages of the French Revolution, there was the pillaging of monasteries, iconoclasm, taking over religious properties, briefly turning the Cathedral of Notre Dame and other churches into temples of reason, and so
hmm
it was just a real, anti-clerical. Now, sure, in the United States, maybe some figures like Thomas Paine had this type of anti-clerical dimension, but I would see that as its ideological origins. And really, France in the 19th century, and especially in the Third Republic of French, late 19th, 20th century, where there was some uh, uh, pretty harsh anti-clerical legislation passed that chased religious orders like the Dominicans and the Jesuits, chased them out of France. Really tried to kind of crush the power of the Catholic Church in France. So that's where I would see its ideological origins. And the three cases where I think it's kind of ratcheted up in violence is in Spain, and it's the type of anti-clerical secularism you see there. In Mexico, but then, interestingly, also in Turkey, the founding figure of modern Turkey, Kemal Ataturk, was a real admirer of France and the French
hmm
Republic, and he sort of wanted to take that anti-clerical um, uh, political ideas and sort of impose it on a Muslim society after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s and 1930s in the founding of the modern nation state of Turkey.
So, do are there examples? I'm trying to think through your book, and I don't remember any, so you can correct me. Are there examples of societies that pass through the different types of secularism? Or is it really, I mean, I can think of like regime changes, like the fall of the Soviet Union obviously produces a big change in modern Russia or something like that. But do you see um, tendencies where a passive secularist society can become um, more combative, or do you see these as more uh, sort of tied closer to the intellectual and other traditions within a society that are going to produce a tendency toward one or the other?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think in the 20th century, a number of the just to focus on Eastern Europe when they were under the Soviet control, there was a type of eliminationist secularism in play. But after the revolutions of 1989, I think they veered pretty quickly in more of a pacifist
hmm
secularist way. Although sometimes you have certain established churches that have privileges in these areas. France, I should qualify. I would say that is some ways the cradle of the combative secularist tradition, but it's certainly moderated over time. The type of fierce Catholic anti-clerical combats you saw in the late
hmm
19th century. Maybe they're still there in ways, and certainly French laïcité has had a tradition of really being concerned about religious garb and public expressions of religion. I think more than the American model, but I would say France is going from a in the revolution kind of a hyper combative secularism to sort of a carrier of this ideological current to today more passive, but certainly some distinctions with the United States and some other places.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, the third category is eliminationist secularism, and this is where we get to, as you mentioned, the Marxist-Leninist sort of ideology being a big part of that, with some pretty major examples of eliminationist secularism. So, give us a brief sense of maybe what exactly you mentioned a bit that Marx had a sort of theory of history where religion would become obsolete. But if anything else you have to say about that, and then what are the main features of the elimination edge of this secularism?
Yeah. You have to begin with Marx as a figure, although it might have earlier roots as well, and then in the Soviet Union after 1917. But Marx, pretty dense work on Hegel is when Marx uses this term opium of the masses, and pretty every educated person knows this. But Marx really never had a theory of like how. He just thought as sort of the proletariat revolution would create more this worldly satisfaction, and this false consciousness of religion would eventually just sort of fade away, becoming a curious relic of humanity's pre-socialist past. Um, and most of his writings dealt like Das Kapital, deals with complex economic matters and class analysis. But with the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin, Trotsky, and others, knew that they had a problem on their hand, especially with Orthodox Church, because there was so much
Mhm.
loyalty among the population at large to the church. So that's when you get a little more theoretical work of exactly how do we achieve religion's obsolescence. And there were what you might call some orthodox Marxists. You say, don't worry about that. Just focus on political development and the development of the proletarian class, and religion will take care of itself. But others, including Lenin, said, no, you really have to actively work this. These are going to be the Orthodox Church, and then eventually, under Stalin, the various religions throughout the Soviet Union were seen as, uh, you know, feudal reactionaries. There's a lot of terminology used that doesn't necessarily name this as religious violence, but that's a
Mhm.
type of backward mentality that's going to just muck up the whole system and create subversive citizens. And so that is when in the very similar to the French Revolution, but even more so the stripping of the church of property and really making very constricted sort of freedom of worship, uh, you know, destroying churches, repurposing them, making monasteries prisons, um, you know, and all kinds of sort of economic penalties, but also a lot of violence too in the
Mhm.
1920s. And then I should also remember just a lot of anti-religious propaganda. Some of that I have pictures of in the uh, in the book. So I mean I could give other examples, but maybe I'll just stop there with the Soviet Union. See if you have any follow ups, since it's kind of the paradigm case. The
Yes, yes, it is. I think one thing that would be interesting to hear from you about is a skeptic to this way of viewing secularism might say a lot of this violence isn't at root about religion. It's about nationalism or ethnicity or other categories that um, were concerned, that the Soviet Union leadership cared about and wanted to crush or something like that. How did you go about distinguishing? No, the motive here is anti-religious violence, or is violence being conducted or suppression being conducted because of religious identity versus the many other types of identities that might be in play.
Yeah, no, that's a fair question, and I deal with it at several points in the book. History, as every good historian will say, is complex. Most events are polycausal, not monocausal in nature. So sometimes I think it really is against the religious sphere, and a real worry that this is a whole source of moral authority and personality and community formation that's apart from Caesar. And
Hmm.
totalitarian societies generally want Caesar, the state, to define education, welfare. So I think there is something I would focus on the religious dimension. But in other cases, in the Soviet Union, in China with say the Tibet issue, or even today, like the situation of the Uyghur Muslims, there's ethnicity as well. So I try to recognize that complexity. What I think one of the real things that sort of Marxist-Leninist ideology contributes to this is sort of this whole theory of history where you can say I'm not just acting in the nature of realpolitik, but that there are laws of history. History
Hmm.
goes from superstition to less superstition and eventually to pure secularity, purely immanent understandings of what is the good life. And so secularism, can, in some ways, it might cloak other motivations because you can say you're only, acting in the name of the flow of world history or the course of history is going to take as these predetermined laws predict it. But yeah, the ethnicity question, national question, and a few others are certainly should be part of the conversation.
Right. When you talk about the laws of history that sort of a Marxist view would have, it makes me wonder. Your book, it focuses a lot on, you could say, a top down perspective on this, a lot about government ideology, policy, how militaries or other government agencies actually attempted to eliminate or combat religion. Did you ever get a sense as you were reading the sources, or as you were, I don't know, reading the secondary literature, were there any um, hesitations? I'm sure there were, but sort of visible hesitations that, I don't know, wow, we're really destroying whole societies here. We're really sort of trying to root out something that um, may or may not be exactly what our ideology is saying it is. It just at some of the examples where you go through just such a thorough attempt to eliminate this aspect of human experience or human society or whatever. I just wondered if was it entirely justifiable through the ideology, or were there a lot of voices of dissent or concern voiced during these processes as well?
Yeah, no, that's a very, very nice question, and the answer is yes. Just to profile the Soviet case, there were voices that say, if you persecute the church, you're gonna have just the opposite effect. You're
Mm,
gonna highlight religion. You're gonna sort of people are gonna come together around religious leaders that they see as being repressed, are persecuted. So I think there and in other cases, you can see. Different voices. Maybe just to shift to Romania, which I have a brief section in on the book. After the during the Cold War, there were some who wanted to have maybe I'll just call it a Leninist, a more combative or eliminationist Leninist approach. But the voices that really prevailed was recognizing that the Romanian Orthodox Church is important for heritage. It's the hearts and minds of people. So there was something of a collusion between the government and the Romanian Orthodox Church, but but not necessarily for other religious minorities, Lutherans, Baptists, and probably the ones that were almost well, I don't want to use a term like universally, but often seen as the biggest problem were proselytizing groups,
mhm,
especially
mhm.
from the West. Like the uh, Mormon Church, Jehovah's Witnesses, those type of religious communities often took it on the chin without much internal opposition.
Yeah, yeah. Also, probably ones that don't have any type of built-in community, historic community within that nation. I
Yeah,
would guess that's
yeah,
part of it too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. At one point in the book, or more than one point, but you spend a good amount of time on Albania, and I believe this is where you say this might be the most extreme example of eliminationist secularism. Give us a sense on why it was so extreme, or why this sort of is near the top of examples of elimination of secularism in action.
Yeah, sure. I did. I did a little field work
Mm,
for this book, and I chose to go to Albania and interview and talk with people, and also went to Lithuania. Lithuania, actually, this connects to your previous question. Lithuania was the only Catholic majority state in the Soviet Union, so there was really less,
mm,
internal opposition in the Soviet Union. They saw Catholics well, and elsewhere, but also in Lithuania, as having ties to the West, to the Pope, and sort of a potentially subversive element of society. But Albania was under the dictator Enver Hoxha. Took eliminationist secularism to extreme uh, limits, and there was persecution early in the Cold War, but in 1967, through a government decree, he essentially criminalized religion. So you could not be a religious individual, you could not, worship, things so severe as you couldn't even name your child after a name in the Bible or the Quran. All the sites of worship were either destroyed or repurposed. Um, and the tremendous climate of fear. I talk with people, and in my research of people very afraid to even tell their children basic Bible stories. They think they might say something at school, and then
Mm.
they would be ratted on by their children. I had one conversation with the dean of a newly formed Islamic university in Tirana, and he told me, he, faced with so much of the anti-religious propaganda, he asked his mom, does God exist? And she said, he does, but don't tell anyone I ever told you that. And that was just his experience growing up in the, in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s.
Wow. How is Albania today? That you said you did some field work. So is there a noticeable resurgence or lack of religion in the society based on this history?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, in Albania, I mean, one thing I maybe say about Eastern Europe generally, it was different. In Albania, because of just the extremity of the approach, there was a real sort of severance of the society from its religious past, just creating
Mm,
sort of religiously illiterate people because it was such a draconian approach. Other places, say like Poland, even though you had a Marxist-Leninist state, it really kind of revived Catholic identity around. So you got to be careful, when you generalize about the
mhm,
different countries. But I think, as in many places, there's been great, elation in being liberated. In the 90s, these Marxist-Leninist regimes falling, but a lot of other cultural confusion as well. And, social security networks that are disrupted, and some even have nostalgia for the past because they thought it's just so confusing and it's such a cutthroat world today. And you have a lot of Western and other missionary groups coming to Albania, so it's a much more kind of pluralistic, even cacophonous
mhm,
situation today. But you still see, Albania, religiously, it's interesting because there's the Orthodox Albanian Church, there's the Catholic Church, and then there is the Sunni Muslims, but there's also a interesting strand of Sufi Bektashi
mm,
Muslim that experienced persecution twice. They were driven out of Turkey by Kemal Ataturk in the 1920s, and then they faced Enver Hoxha and that persecution. And I actually had a chance to meet with the leader of the Bektashi Muslims in Albania. But again, you have much more religious plurality today and uh, in Albania than in the past.
yeah, interesting. Okay, there's plenty more we could discuss. We haven't even talked about Maoist China and so forth. That'll have to be for the reader to discover in the book. I want to just conclude with a few questions, thinking about how Christians should um, really interpret and take to heart what you've written about here. The first one is this may be becoming from our context in particular, but one of the more popular reference points for talking about secularism here at Upper House is Charles Taylor's *A Secular Age*. That's a very though it's a gargantuan book that I doubt few people go through all 800 pages of it. Its framework of thinking about secularism as largely, or the secular age as largely something that's happening sort of in conceptions of the self and in modern Western pluralistic society is pretty popular. It's a way of engaging with modern academic thought and so forth. What do you find missing from a sort of conception of secularism that really focuses on something like Taylor's philosophical framework versus something like I see yours as a much different approach to some of the same bigger questions about our
Yeah.
contemporary moment?
Yeah, no, I could. Would you mind if I just said one quick thing about the Asian situation? Because this
Oh,
was just a
please do.
huge learning for me.
Yes.
I do focus on Maoism, but really, I just don't think it's people are that aware of how much Buddhism was persecuted in the 20th century. But when
Mm,
you look at, there were three Buddhist enclaves in the Soviet Union. Mongolian Buddhism was almost completely wiped out by Stalinist stooge in the 1930s. Then you have
mm,
China, then you have Tibet, you have North Korea, you have Cambodia when Pol Pot tried to just erase Buddhism. So I think that just should be better known. But that was a real learning to me to keep connecting all the dots between the Buddhist communities that faced intense persecution.
Even Vietnam
You know,
with the U.S. involvement in I mean, if you know
yeah,
that history, some of the situation in Vietnam makes a bit more sense from a U.S. perspective as well, and the role that Buddhists played in protesting even U.S. involvement
mhm,
in the
yeah.
area. Yeah.
Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I mean, in terms of Charles Taylor, I would say my book is shorter than his, and I'm a historian. And he is a philosopher, so you're maybe just
Hmm.
going to have different approaches to the topic. And I've learned a lot from Taylor, and I don't see myself necessarily arguing, against him. I say more or less, he's focused kind of more on big ideas and thinkers and conceptions of the self and personhood and those type of things. Where I'm talking more about political realities and laws and
Hmm.
uh, secret police and communities on the ground. So it might come down to a disciplinary difference. But at the same time, I think he's largely kind of North Atlantic oriented. His views of
Yes.
secularism, not really this, globally. And so I think again there are many insights in the book, but I think it's kind of even for as long as it is, I would say there's a little bit of myopia. And when he's speaking about, sometimes he's a little more moonstruck by modernity than I am. I think has many good aspects about modernity, but I think if he took into consideration some of the things that I said, he might be a little less moonstruck, and he'd say, "Oh,
Hmm.
actually, Western modernity has done, maybe it's unleashed some real problems in
Hmm.
the world." So I don't know. Does that answer that
Yeah,
question?
that makes a lot of sense. I think also, I mean, I'm just thinking of this right now, but um, Taylor's philosophical approach doesn't really, and this might be a strength of it to some, but it doesn't really, sort of make room for a Leninist or Marxist, like the Leninist Marxist categories are not what he's operating with, and that's so much a part of your story or your history is looking at how those ways of seeing the world work themselves out in politics in society, and that's just part of the broader scope that he's not interested in or interested in integrating into the other parts of what he's thinking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, to a degree, maybe we're both doing intellectual history. He does more what I
Yeah.
would call an internalist intellectual history. He's
Right.
looking at books and their ideas and discussing them. Now, where I'm interested, not necessarily like getting Marx right or Leninist right, but recognize the unintended consequences and the complexity once ideas are birthed in the
Hmm.
intellectual realm, how they might take various forms, including some that they are originated would never have anticipated. Um, and so,
Right.
I would see a difference there.
Yes, that's great. Okay, last question. And I'll start with just a recollection of my own. When I grew up conservative evangelical, was somewhat interested in the apologetics scene of the 90s and 2000s, where this idea that you propose in a much more nuanced or well resourced way was actually quite popular in apologetic spaces, which was and I'm sure there's a million internet memes that do something like this too, but sort of say, secularists critique religious people for the Crusades and the Inquisition or something like that. Well, I'll take your Crusades and Inquisition and I'll raise you a Holocaust and a Soviet style
Yeah.
oppressive secularist society. And on those scales, the Christian looks a lot better than the new atheist or whatever. And that's the really crude sort of way that this is often talked about uh, in popular culture, maybe even in some church context. There's a sense of some of the scope that you really get into of what at least the most extreme version of secularism have produced a lot of misery and destruction in our world. How how do you think about that same type of debate, given that you've now spent a lot of time actually documenting how secularism has actually functioned, at least in these examples in
Yeah,
the
no,
world?
I mean, I think it has. I would think religious people, whether they're Christian or others, the narrative that religion is inherently irrational and evil and contributes to violence. Yeah, I think that's not a plausible plausible narrative. Once upon a
Right.
time there were witches and the Inquisition, and then secularity and the Enlightenment came along. And, I even want to argue a lot of the people who paved the way, make the case for passive secularism are actually religiously motivated. Many religious minorities, wanted to see passive
Right.
secularism. So there's religion and secular dimensions to what I call in the book passive secularism. But at several points in the book, particularly in the introduction and conclusion, I say quite clearly, in no way am I trying to sort of keep sort of a competitive who's perpetrated the most violence in history, or to say that religion has always been lily white and it's never contributed to. I think any respectable historian in the wars of religion and the English Civil Wars and the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre,
Mhm.
certainly, that gets complicated because what do you actually mean by religious violence?
Right.
So on the one hand, I would say yes, certainly religion has played a role, but sometimes when religious violence is trotted out, just like secularist violence, you have to recognize that polycausality in history. That sometimes that what's labeled religious violence, like say in the Balkans, for example, yes, it's religious violence, but there's ethnicity and language and competing narratives of history and political power. Often a lot goes in that. So I would say maybe in these secular religion debates, everyone be just a little more humble in recognizing the complexity of history, and there might be simplistic narratives on both sides that need to be deflated a little bit.
Well, that's always the writ of the historian, is to call for more complexity and nuance.
Right,
So thanks, Tal,
right,
for
right.
ending us on that.
Made my profession proud.
That's right. That's right. I often feel like I'm saying some version of that as well. I think if nothing else, Broken Altars reminds us of just the complexity of the 20th century in particular, a century of so much technological progress and progress on multiple, on medicine and other things, and also the scale of violence can just be breathtaking sometimes. I mean, you have a very um, uh, uh, I don't want to say clinical, but you're just sort of documenting in a emotionless type way um, what's occurring, and some of the sentences or paragraphs, you just sort of stop and just try to take in exactly what what was just stated about the number of um, priests that were killed, or mosques that were closed, or whatever in a given period of time, and it's just quite remarkable at points to recognize just how vast the story was in the 20th century. So, Tal, thank you for the book. The book again is Broken Altars: Secularist Violence in Modern History, out with Yale Press. And Tal is right; it's much shorter than Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. It's you could get through it probably in a quarter
Right.
of the time, or something like that. So, if that's a selling point, keep that in mind as well. And of course, thank you, listeners, watchers, for tuning into the Upwards podcast. We hope you've enjoyed today's conversation. For more information about the Stephen Laura Brown Foundation, please visit slbf.org, where we just passed the 150 episode mark. So there's many other conversations like this one to check them out. Check them out on our website. Until next time, go in peace.